successful restoration of natural and associated values of protected areas. I'd like us to think about the kinds of tools, strategies, and approaches that we might use for addressing our capacity needs. And ultimately, we can look at how some of the ideas that come out of our discussions this afternoon can help to shape the program of the IUCN going forward. What might we suggest that the organization take on in terms of tool development to support the capacity to implement ecological restoration that supports protected area values? We actually have a motion that is in the system to be considered and hopefully become a resolution here at the Congress that is directly related to embedding some of these ideas in the IUCN Work Program. And we'll distribute copies of that later for you to have a look at. So why are we interested in the issue of building capacity for restoration in and around protected areas? Certainly, as many of you know, and some of you may not, we've just launched a new issue in the best practice guide, in the IUCN Best Practice Guidelines for Protected Areas on ecological restoration for protected areas, which really synthesizes the state of knowledge in the field of restoration in and around protected areas and provides best practice principles, guidelines, and supporting information from case studies to help us understand what we need to do to be successful in restoring protected area values. This seems, in my mind anyway, to be a fairly timely time for this publication, as we're seeing targets in IG targets under the CBD strategic plan, for example, that are specifically focused on restoration as well as on expanding the protected areas estate, but also managing it effectively, looking at connectivity and other issues that go beyond simply a coverage issue. Restoration certainly being a significant part of that. It's being called for in the program of work on protected areas, and we're also seeing increasing reference to and program development around restoration within the IUCN's program. Fundamentally, because of this, I think that restoration is certainly, we need the capacity to restore, in many ways, to restore our sense of hope that through action we can really achieve our shared vision for a world in which nature is valued and conserved. And I'm hoping that we'll get from these discussions this afternoon some sense of the capacity needs that we have, and the tools that we may require to restore that hope for action and to actually enable that action. So, as I said, we've just launched this best practice guidelines, which articulate 3 key principles for successful restoration. These principles are effectiveness, efficiency, and engagement. And I think when we're looking at capacity, we're looking really at the capacity to be all 3 of those things, to restore in a way that addresses the breadth of all 3 of these principles. We have a handout that we've distributed that you can refer to throughout our discussions this afternoon if you want to, that encapsulates the key messages that are the foundation of these principles. Essentially, when we're looking at effectiveness, I think in many cases this is the way restoration has traditionally been viewed. Effectiveness in restoring ecological structure and function, in enhancing connectivity, and essentially restoring the natural values of ecosystems. In this case, we've also, however, recognizing that effectiveness does also require or include the concept of restoring the cultural relationships that people have with protected areas, and that in order to be effective in restoration, that often that cultural dimension is also a part of the way we need to address ecological restoration for protected areas. While we're considering how we will be effective in achieving the reestablishing the natural and cultural and other associated values of protected areas, we also need to do so in a way that's efficient, that maximizes benefits, whether those benefits be, for example, for ecosystem service provisioning, carbon storage, or other benefits that are not necessarily directly associated with those that are traditionally seen as the specific values of a protected area itself. And finally, the third dimension of this is to be engaging, to work with communities, with other partners and stakeholders outside of protected areas, to engage visitors, to help people understand the value of the protected area system, of restoration, and more broadly of nature, so that they become engaged and participate in these processes. Just to remind you that this is a very short synopsis of the motion that we have submitted, that we're hoping that the Members' Assembly will adopt, asking that the IUCN, the CBD, and other organizations involved in nature conservation adopt this approach to restoration in their programs, prioritize restoration efforts to support achievement of the IG targets, not just those that are specific to protected areas or restoration, but more broadly, and that they develop and implement tools to improve capacity, essentially the topic of our discussion this afternoon. That's essentially all I'm going to say as an overview, just to set the stage for our discussions. Joe Mullengoy, who's now with, have I got your affiliations correct, Joe? The United Nations University Institute of Advanced Studies and the Institute for Advanced Livelihoods, right? Formerly with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biodiversity, is going to share very briefly with you some of his thoughts around building capacity for effectiveness in restoration. Sasha Alexander, who's with the Society for Ecological Restoration, has some ideas to share around how we can address this, what I was saying, maximizing benefits. And he's going to look specifically at some finance incentives that can be considered appropriate for protected areas. But we certainly don't see efficiency as being limited to finance. And Andrej Soving from Slovenia is going to share with us some of his thoughts around engagement to help set the stage for how we may consider our own capacity needs regarding engaging restoration. So Joe, would you be comfortable picking up? Thank you. I'll just get my way.
I visited, first of all, Karen gave me 3 minutes. Now I see that you have more time. But anyway, I visited recently Bangladesh, and the place I visited is the Korean export processing zone, and it is in the province of Chittagong. I was really very much impressed by the fact that the zone, the Korean export processing zone, looked like this in 1999. Completely barren and really desolation, no wildlife, no inhabitants. It was really completely empty. And there are places even today that look like that. Then Yonghwan is a holding that manufacture many things like Nike shoes, etc., North Face jacket, and a lot of sportswear. And he was very much interested in rehabilitating his place. And when you see the place today, it looks like this. After planting more than 1.7 million trees and putting grass on the slopes to prevent erosion, and after they created 17 water bodies. So the place really looks very, very nice, and by waiting for restoration, I said, very effective. So then I went there especially to try to see what were the key factors that made the restoration so successful. And I wanted to see how we can replicate that success in many other places, not only in Asia, but I was even thinking more about Africa. As you can see, I come from Africa. So today, because we are talking about capacity building, I had the 6 guidelines that we have behind the principle of effective restoration. I have them in the back of my mind. And I try to look at the need for capacity in in Chittagong in the Korean export processing zone. Of course, when we talk about capacity, we have to think about human capacities, institutional capacities, as well as financial capacity. Now, in terms of human capacity, I did a lot of studies there just to try to find out if they had all the different expertise needed to do the job very well. I have to say that they did not have all the expertise, but they were very lucky. They did so many things in the very right way. But really, they needed to have engineers, as you can see, the way the place is with hills and some areas were below the sea level. So they had to level, but it was necessary to do that in a way that was not going to disturb too much the ecology. So then they had engineers, a lot of agronomists to try to see where to put which species of tree or which species of plant in general. They had people who could understand the local communities and discuss with them, explain to them why it was necessary to try to rehabilitate. So the capacities they had, but when I think about other places, for example, when I think about my own country, it is very difficult to have all this expertise at the same time in the same location. That is why I said something I like to do always, if you do some training workshops, and where we can try to provide some kind of holistic view of all the issues that we can find in a place where we have to do restoration. And of course, I've started working on e-learning modules for restoration using a lot of the materials that you have produced. And my hope is that at the beginning of next year, we'll be able to start discussing these e-modules and try to include them all together. In terms of institutional capacity, it is just on purpose I had that picture of a lady because we always try to have humans at the center of all our thought. And as here, even myself, I had to talk to them to try to understand exactly what they felt, if they liked what was done, etc. So that was quite interesting and a very interesting experience. Of course, when Young Ones started working in that place, they developed a very, very important environmental impact assessment report, very detailed, and that document has been approved by the government. But unfortunately, today, the government, after they saw the beauty of the place now, they would like to get it back because it had no value, but now it looks so good. So they are giving a lot of problems. But anyway, we have that environmental impact report that is very, very important. And of course, in the case of protected areas, we have also other different documents that we need to have. The plan of action, of course, management effectiveness plans. And in terms of financial capacity, this is where I was a little bit hesitant because Young One gave a blank check to the people who are working at the Korean export processing zone. Because restoration is always very expensive. And I don't believe that it is really something that anybody can do anytime. But anyway, in this particular case, we had a businessman who was just ready to give all the necessary money to do anything they needed to do. And they did many things very right. But of course, when we talk about protected areas, restoration of protected areas, we have the GEF, 60% of allocation for protected areas. We have the Life Web initiative that can help people identify some sources of funding. And then we have a number of other new sources of funding that can be used as part of the capacity building for finances. Now, I believe that with a good capacity building program, it is possible to replicate what we have at the Korean export processing zone. And in fact, we started already working with some governments, Cambodia and Vietnam, to try to see if the success of KPZ can be replicated there. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I'd like to invite Sasha Alexander to come up and say a few words. I think well actually, do you have time for a couple of questions?
Oh, yeah.
We have time for maybe one or two questions before we move on.
So, I know it's expensive, but how expensive? What did it cost?
Yes, this is a key question I keep on asking.
Yeah.
In fact, the CEO of Young One was here with me yesterday, and again I asked him the question, but he could not give me any figure. But when I went to the document, I saw that there was a figure of 200 million just for rehabilitation of KBZ. I don't know if the money has been used already or if it is still being used. So it's quite a lot.
Yes. Is it necessary that restoration must be expensive? I'm asking this because in Kenya, there was that green belt movement that involved women, and all they did was just planting trees, seedlings, and there wasn't much technology required. We just planted trees in the degraded areas. And we probably might say it's so expensive that we may scare people from doing simple restoration, which could also be very effective and efficient.
Yeah, of course, some restoration may not be that expensive, and we have to encourage that. But it depends on many factors. Consider the area that you want to restore, consider the status of the ecosystem you want to restore. So those things will really tell you how much you have to spend to restore the place. Like when you remember the picture I showed you, it is just sand that is left there. A lot of erosion, and there was no water there. So it was quite difficult just to plant trees and then think that things will go like no. So it was necessary to do more than that. But of course, in some places you don't need to do all that, and it may not be that expensive. But you're right, we should not make people be afraid that it is too expensive and then they don't do anything.
We'll take one more question. Andre?
It's not a question, it's just an explanation. I'm a civil engineer, I'm a hydrologist, and I was designing restoration projects, and I'll show some. We'll show some later. But let me tell you this. When we were doing this, people were often asking this question, how much it cost? And I never remember exactly the price, but then I said, okay, 1 kilometer of the river to be restored cost the equivalent of the price for 10 billion cars. So this is how I kept in my mind. People immediately get much better impression.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Sasha? Following on from the question of finance?
Yes, absolutely. Not all restoration is expensive. And as Karen mentioned, there's a lot of ways to look at efficiency when you're doing ecological restoration. Here I've focused on here.
Microphone needs some restoration.
So here I focused on the financial and incentive mechanism, but as you'll see in my very brief presentation, that it does touch on other efficiencies that need to be coordinated in order to really have a successful restoration project.
There.
Okay. So in order for restoration to be efficient, there are a number of enabling factors which are conducive or that facilitate efficiency. One of those is as we talk about a lot here in this conference, is the policy and legal frameworks. These are frameworks that mobilize communities, that give stakeholders a sense of ownership, a sense of responsibility, a sense of long-term commitment. And they also can be very useful in facilitating financial transfers or other incentive mechanisms. Another enabling factor are the institutional structures and the organizations. These are often NGOs and community-based organizations, civil society organizations. They are able to bring stakeholders together. They have credibility with the local communities. And they also can play an important role in monitoring and managing the incentives for financial transfers. Another factor is the knowledge transfer, the abilities, the skills, having the tools and technologies, whether those are concrete tools or whether those are tools that require vision, require an understanding of the ecosystem. And those are extremely important in terms of understanding the obstacles to restoration, as well as leveraging any opportunities that may be available for restoration. And as the best practice guideline goes into quite a amount of detail here, I'll just put this up here so that you can see the results of efficiency in restoration. Well-designed projects, multiple benefits, lasting partnerships, and stewardship.